They say the land remembers. Even when blood dries and bones turn to dust, the earth does not forget the screams. In the shadowed heart of Yorubaland, a darkness stirred, not for a season, not for a passing rain, but for 16 long, soul-crushing years. It wasn't just a war, it was a reckoning. A brutal unraveling of loyalty, legacy, and power. Mothers buried sons they never got to name. Towns vanished without a trace, swallowed by silence. And at the core of this storm was a name whispered with awe and terror, Ibadan. This wasn't just a city, it was a war-born beast, fed by blood, hardened by betrayal, and drunk on domination. After the ancient Oyo Empire crumbled into dust, warriors, refugees, and mercenaries didn't mourn. They regrouped, they chose a hilltop, and from war-scorched soil, they built a fortress. A new order, a monster cloaked as a city. Ibadan rose with the fury of the betrayed. It tore through the lands of Ede, crushed the Egba, and bled the Akoko and Igbomina territories dry. But conquest was only the beginning. What came next was something far more terrifying. They sent the Ajale, the enforcers of Ibadan's iron will. Not soldiers, tyrants. These weren't men who negotiated. They arrived like storms, with muskets, machetes, and mandates to control. The Ajale didn't just take tribute. They consumed entire lives. They claimed crops, livestock, daughters, and dignity. Kings, once sacred, were dragged from their stools, made to kneel before their conquerors like beggars. And the people, they burned with silent rage. Until one day, that silence cracked. From the hills of Ekiti to the hearts of Ijesha warriors, a whisper grew into a scream. Enough. And so began a war that would splinter empires, shake the gods, and change Yorubaland forever. The war they would later call Ekiti-Parapo, but the warriors who survived it had another name for it, Kurunje, the war that devoured everything. What drove peaceful towns to rise with fire in their hands? What secrets did the Ajale hide behind their brutal rule? And what became of Ibadan when the people it once dominated began to fight like beasts with nothing left to lose? This is not just a tale. It is a grave, a mirror, a warning. And by the time we reach the end, you may find yourself questioning the price of power and the true cost of silence. Welcome to Folktale Cinema, where legends are not just told, they're unearthed. If you're drawn to stories that grip the soul and leave shadows behind your eyes, like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment below. If you lived under the Ajale, would you have rebelled or survived in silence? The story begins now, but be warned, some legends don't sleep easy. When oppression becomes routine, it doesn't just crush bones, it warps the soul. In the towns that fell under Ibadan's tightening grip, everyday life was no longer their own. Traditions, those sacred lifelines passed from ancestors to descendants, were severed like cords. Some festivals, once bursting with color, music, and sacred meaning, were abruptly banned. No drumming, no dancing, no rituals to honor the spirits. Not without permission. Market days, the heart of community life, were no longer free gatherings of trade and laughter. Now they came with a price. Ibadan's tax collectors watched like vultures, extorting merchants and punishing anyone who dared to undercut their levies. Even children began to forget the smell of roasted yams and the sound of their mother's bargaining. Names changed, street names, clan names. Even the prayers offered to the gods had to begin with a new devotion, not to the deities of old, but to Ibadan's supremacy. Every word uttered in public had to acknowledge the city that loomed over them like a shadow. The Ajale weren't just administrators. They were a walking declaration. You belong to us now. This wasn't governance, it was occupation. Imagine waking each day to the memory of your grandfather's throne, now occupied by a puppet king. Imagine walking through a town where your father's voice once commanded respect, only to see him bow to outsiders with muskets and foreign tongues. That's the world these people inherited. But there's a truth that every tyrant eventually forgets. The human spirit doesn't die quietly. You can steal a person's crops. You can take their land. You can silence their leaders. But if you dig deep enough into their pain, what you'll find is not resignation, it's defiance. And that defiance, it's old, it's ancient. It's not something taught in schools. It pulses in the blood, passed down like a birthright. Even the meek, when cornered, will bare their teeth. And all across the lands of Ekiti, Ijesha, Akoko, and Igbomina, people were reaching their breaking point. Whispers turned to murmurs. Murmurs became meetings. Rage began to gather like storm clouds behind every eye. The tyranny had stretched too long. Something was going to break. And it did, in a quiet town called Okemisi. Hidden among the hills of Ekiti land, Okemisi was not a city of warriors. It was a place of shrines, markets, and age-old traditions. But even peace has its limits. It was during a sacred festival, one meant to honor the gods and bring the community together, that something unforgivable happened. The Ajale's men arrived uninvited, swaggering into the town square with their usual air of entitlement. But this time they went further. They desecrated the shrine, looting offerings meant for the gods, trampling sacred ground with bloody boots. They spat on the divine. And worse, much worse, they turned their cruelty on the women. They dragged them from homes, beat them in public, stripped them of dignity. The town didn't cry out, it trembled. But someone did rise, a young warrior prince named Fabunmi Adesoya. Fabunmi was not born of fear, he was born of fire. A native of Okemisi, he had watched his people suffer long enough. That day, as the festival turned to horror, something ancient stirred inside him. Rage. Not just for what he saw, but for everything his people had endured in silence. He didn't wait. He didn't negotiate. With his blade in hand, Fabunmi stormed the Ajale's quarters. He moved like thunder, cutting through guards, spilling blood in every corridor, until he found the man responsible, Ajaleoton. He didn't give a speech. He didn't ask questions. He drove his sword through the man's chest. And just like that, the war began. Blood on the floor, fire in the sky. The rebellion had been born not in council halls or royal palaces, but in the raw fury of one man who refused to kneel. When word of Oton's death spread, it didn't just travel, it exploded. From Ekiti to Ijesha, from Akoko to Igbomina, communities that had once cowered now stood. Fabunmi's defiance had sparked something no one could stop. Old chiefs, once silenced, began to speak again. Warriors gathered their rusted weapons. Hidden drums, long forbidden, began to beat once more. The sound of resistance was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. In the royal palace of Oton, a historic gathering was held. Chiefs, kings, and warlords from across Ekiti land, men who had once ruled separately, stood side by side. For the first time in generations, they spoke not of fear, but of unity. There, in the heart of Oton, they made a declaration that would echo across time. O Tuge, enough is enough. That wasn't just a phrase, it was a prophecy, a vow carved into stone. And from that defiant cry, a powerful alliance was born, the Ekiti-Parapo, the Ekiti Confederacy, a brotherhood forged not by ambition, but by necessity. Bound by sacred oaths, by spilled blood, and by a shared determination to end Ibadan's reign of terror. They had no standing army, no artillery, no foreign weapons. What they had were hills for cover, herbs for healing, hunters who knew the forest like breath, and a relentless hunger for freedom. That was enough, and they were not alone. Ijesha joined them. Then came the Igbomina. Akoko followed. Even the ancient kingdom of Ife, cradle of the Yoruba people, offered its silent nod of support. What began as one man's rebellion had become a movement, a flood. The Ajel were no longer feared. They were hunted. Ibadan, once untouchable, now faced resistance in every corner of its empire. Convoys were ambushed. Garrisons were burned. Tributes stopped arriving. For the first time, the great war city saw its dominance flicker. But the Ekiti-Parapo knew the road ahead would not be easy. They weren't fighting cowards. They were challenging a war machine. Ibadan's warriors were legendary, battle-hardened, ruthless, trained for total war. They had commanders with decades of experience and access to foreign weaponry. Guns, powder, cannons. The Confederacy had none of that, but they had the people. They had passion. And they had something Ibadan had long forgotten. A reason to fight that went deeper than conquest. The desperate, burning need to be free. And freedom, when truly desired, is more powerful than steel. From the caves of Igbeti to the forests of Iloro, secret gatherings became war councils. Farmers became scouts. Women became spies. Even children carried messages hidden in baskets of yams. Herbalists brewed charms of protection, warriors trained with spears, and messengers darted through the night like ghosts. Ibadan tried to suppress them, but every action only fueled the fire. This was no longer a skirmish. It was a revolution. The hills had come alive. And now the land itself would choose a side. This was only the beginning. Nestled beneath the towering, weather-beaten hills of Esiala, a strange new town began to take form, not born from peace or prosperity, but from the raw necessity of war. The Confederate camp, a gathering of allied Eastern Yoruba forces, steadily grew into something more, a city forged in iron, fire, and resolve. Over 40,000 people came to call this war-hardened town home. Warriors sharpened their swords beneath the open sky. Blacksmiths pounded glowing metal into weapons under the watchful name of Ogun, their deity of war and forge. Women stirred pots to feed soldiers, mended torn uniforms, and whispered prayers under their breath. Children, wide-eyed and barefoot, ran between tents, learning the ways of hardship before they could even spell the word peace. But even as this war city pulsed with the blood of defiance, one vital heartbeat was missing. Leadership. Unity. A voice strong enough to guide the thunder that was coming. And then he came. Okadenbe Akbokungboro, the warlord whispered about across coasts and kingdoms, hailed in faraway Egypt, cloaked in myth and drenched in battle scars. At first he hesitated. The call to lead was a heavy burden, and Okadembe was not one to chase glory without cause. But something stirred within him, a force deeper than ambition. Duty, legacy. When he finally rose, when his silhouette emerged on the outskirts of Esiala, the very earth seemed to shift. The townspeople gathered. The wind hushed. Every eye turned as Ogadembe rode in. Tall, broad-shouldered, eyes burning like coals lit by Oranmila himself. The war camp erupted, not with celebration, but with hope. Real, tangible hope. Young Fabumi, the former commander, stepped aside with grace and respect. Age bowed to experience. Rank yielded to greatness. And so, Ogadembe was crowned. Not as a king, not as a chief, but as Sariki Mayaki, commander-in-chief of the Ekiti-Parapo alliance. His rule wasn't carved in crown or scroll. It was sealed with steel and spirit. And thus began a war the land had never seen before. A war not just of swords and rifles, but of fate itself. This was no mere battle. This was Kiriji. The drums of Kiriji, the first cannon fire, did not just split the sky. It cracked open history. Drums thundered like the heartbeat of the gods themselves. The hills shook. The very air grew thick with dust and death. From that moment forward, one name rang like a curse across the land. Kiriji, a name born from the sound of cannon fire, one that would forever echo in the ears of generations to come. But who truly was this Ogadembe? Long before war made him legend, he was just a boy, born in the humble village of Ataran, tucked on the edge of Elasa, in what we now know as Osun State. Even as a child, he was different, larger than life, taller than most, stronger than any, agile beyond belief. His hands could wrestle down grown men before his voice had deepened. He was drawn to the traditions of Yoruba wrestling, not for sport, but for survival, for glory. By his teens, the people stopped calling him a boy. They called him something else. Ogadembe, the one who subdues the mighty. A name earned, not given. A title soaked in sweat, bruises, and defiance. As he grew, so did his reputation. His combat skills became unmatched, but it wasn't just the way he fought. It was how he thought. Ogadembe understood the mind of war. Strategy flowed through his veins like ancestral blood. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a leader the people would follow into the very mouth of death. He rose swiftly through the ranks of the Ajesha warrior class, becoming a living symbol of resistance in a time where kingdoms clashed like angry spirits and politics bled into the soil. By 1879, the echoes of war had reached a fever pitch. On one side stood Ibadan, expansionist, unrelenting, driven by power. On the other, the Eastern Confederacy, fighting not just for territory but for their very existence. Between them lay the cursed stream of Fejeboju, now dark and swollen with the blood of the fallen. Warriors from both camps lay twisted on its banks, faces frozen in agony. Esiela, once a gathering point, had become a fortress. Its hills and trenches groaned under the weight of cannonballs and rifle shells. War had turned it into a living grave. Yet the Eastern Alliance was far from broken. Imported rifles from Hamburg gleamed in the hands of Parapo warriors. Cannons lined the cliffs, their roars tearing through Ibadan ranks. And still the Western forces refused to fall. Why? Because of one man, Arona Kakanfo Latusa. To speak his name is to summon the ghost of Ibadan's might. Born in the village of Ira, near present-day Oyo, Latusa was never meant for greatness. Yet fate doesn't ask permission. Upon arriving in Ibadan, he joined the private army of the influential Unmola and quickly rose to become his captain. Ruthless, brilliant, fearless. Latusa clawed his way to the top, not through birthright, but through cunning and sheer will. In time, he seized the title asterisk Ariona Kakamfo, the supreme military leader of Yorubaland. In practice, he ruled Ibadan with an iron fist and a burning eye for conquest. His policies were brutal, especially toward eastern Yorubaland. He placed harsh agents in towns like Ede, Ilesa, Otun, and Ikole. Towns that once knew peace were now crushed under Ibadan's heel. His need to control Ekiti, Ijesha, and beyond wasn't just political, it was obsessive. And so the fire was lit. 16 years the Kiriji War would rage. 16 years of blood, betrayal, and heartbreak. Town after town reduced to ash. Fathers buried sons, mothers became widows. Entire generations vanished like smoke into wind. The Battle of Ikirun, 1878. A name forever etched into the bones of history. A coalition force, Parapo warriors, fierce and loyal, laid siege to Ibadan's positions. But Latusa struck back with thunderous fury. The eastern lines broke, chaos erupted. As they fled, hundreds of warriors plunged into the Oten River, desperate to escape. They drowned beneath its murky waters. From that day forward, the battle was known as Yalumi, the drowning. But the Parapo were not done. Esiela became more than a fortress. It was a furnace, melting fear into iron. Over time, it transformed into the symbol of Eastern resistance. Again and again, battles erupted. Igbajo, Iro, Otun Ekiti, towns torn apart by the ferocity of war. Igbajo became a ghost town. Its fields churned into muddy graveyards. Cannon fire flattened entire blocks. At Iro, women fled with babies on their backs, chased by fire and blade. Smoke hung in the air like a curse, no Otun Ekiti. A town proud and defiant, it paid dearly for its bravery. Ibadan forces launched endless waves of assault. Again and again, every inch of ground soaked in sorrow. Crops burned, homes shattered. But the Parapo alliance never surrendered. They fought not for victory alone, but for identity. For the right to live free from the shadow of Ibadan's whip. Trade routes crumbled, rivers ran dark, even the birds flew low as if mourning. But still, the war raged on. The air over Okemisi was thick, not just with gunpowder and smoke, but with something older, heavier. The kind of weight that hangs in the hearts of those who know they are fighting for more than just land or glory. They were defending memory, ancestry, destiny. Okemisi was more than just a city. It was the cradle of the resistance, the symbolic birthplace of the Kiriji War. And every stone, every winding street, every sacred hill was transformed into a line in the sand. There, the Ekiti-Parapo alliance stood firm, their backs to the city they had sworn to defend, their eyes set on the storm rolling toward them. Ibadan wanted to break their will, but Okamesi was the heart of their rebellion, and hearts do not break easily. Each clash on that sacred soil told its own brutal story. The defenders were not just warriors, they were sons of the land, and daughters too, who had watched too many of their homes set ablaze, too many of their elders humiliated by distant powers. When Ibadan troops surged through the forest and approached the city, they were met with a resistance that had nothing to lose. Swords met machetes, muskets spat fire in the night. The groan of wounded men became the city's new lullaby. But Okamesi was just the beginning. The fire of war spread like a curse across the region. Further east, the towns of Oka, Azi, and Ipoti, lifelines of the Parapo, became vital arteries in the resistance's survival. If Okamesi was the heart, these were the veins. Supplies, reinforcements, and intelligence pulsed through these paths, and Ibadan knew it. They didn't just want to win the war, they wanted to choke it. So came the raids, endless and merciless. Roads once safe for trade and travel turned to ambush zones. Forests that once echoed with children's laughter now howled with gunfire and screams. Skirmishes around these critical towns weren't just strategic, they were personal. Men fought with the desperation of knowing that if these towns fell, so too would the dream of freedom. The Ibadan forces, well-drilled and viciously determined, launched attack after attack. Their mission was clear: starve the resistance, crush it from the inside. It was no longer just about superior numbers. It was about cutting through the Parapo's lifelines and watching them bleed out slowly. And yet, the Ekiti warriors held the line. Even as the chaos spread further to towns like Ibari and Ibada, where trenches scarred the earth and tree canopies became battlefields, the alliance refused to back down. Every patch of soil became a fortress. Every street corner, a grave for the invader. The guerrilla tactics employed by the Parapo were not just military strategies. They were born of survival, born of knowing the land better than any outsider could. These weren't just battles. They were stories written in blood and smoke. And as the war dragged on, it evolved. This was no longer a skirmish between rival city-states. This was a brutal civil war, one that saw thousands perish, one that introduced imported cannons and modern rifles into a conflict that had once been fought with swords and bows. The Kiriji War would come to be remembered not just as the longest indigenous conflict in Yoruba history, but also the most technologically advanced. But even iron will can bend under prolonged fire. While the Parapo fought tooth and nail for survival, cracks began to spread in the empire that once seemed unstoppable. Deep within the fortified walls of Ibadan, the heart of its military command beat slower, weaker. Behind those grand walls, whispers grew louder, and at the center of it all stood a man whose name once inspired fear from Abokuta to the riverbanks of Iyesha, Areona Kakanfo Latusa. Latusa wasn't just a warlord, he was the embodiment of Ibadan's dominance. He ruled with discipline, dread, and a belief in absolute power. Under him, Ibadan rose like a colossus. Its armies feared, its word law. But power, once absolute, has a way of isolating the one who holds it. And fear, once sown into the soil, grows wild and uncontrollable. The war outside had drained Ibadan's resources. But the real danger was growing inside its own walls. Latusa's men, once fiercely loyal, began to doubt. Supplies were drying up. Battles once easily won now dragged for weeks. And the weight of unending war sat heavy on the shoulders of even the fiercest commanders. Among them was Balogun Oho Aburumaku, also called Oho Bikun, once one of Latusa's most trusted generals, a man who had marched into many battles under his command. But in 1885, a single disagreement between them sparked a rift that would unravel the empire from within. The disagreement was, on the surface, trivial, a quarrel over a single slave. But in war, small things carry enormous meaning. It wasn't about the slave, it was about respect, about power, about dignity. For Oho Bikun, it was a final insult. For Latusa, it was a challenge he could not afford to let stand. And so pride clashed with pride. Within days, their argument became the talk of the palace. The halls of Ibadan buzzed with whispers. Rumors of rebellion danced in the air like sparks near dry grass. Warriors once loyal to the death now cast side glances. The mighty Ariona Kakanfo could feel it, the tremble beneath his feet. The war outside hadn't broken him, but the erosion of loyalty from within, that did. Cornered, abandoned by fate and fellowship, Latusa made a final, dreadful choice. He didn't go out to battle. He didn't summon his warriors for one last stand. Instead, in the silence of his chambers, with only his pride and despair for company, the great warlord ended his own life. A man who had once boasted that he would crush the Ekiti in 3 days had been crushed instead, not by sword or bullet, but by the crumbling weight of solitude and broken trust. His death sent a shockwave across Yorubaland. Ibadan's warriors, once proud and fierce, now wandered like men lost at sea. Their commander was gone, their purpose frayed, morale turned to dust. Every inch gained on the battlefield now seemed meaningless. And the war, oh, the war, it still raged on. But now it was a war of ghosts. The land bore the scars. Forests once lush were now graves. Rivers ran brown with mud and red with blood. Families displaced, homes reduced to ash. Once thriving towns, Otun, Ilawe, Igbajo, echoed with silence where markets once bustled. Over 200,000 men had marched to war. Thousands would never return. The rest, even if they survived, would never be the same. Still, the Ekiti-Parapo stood. Bruised, battered, but not broken. Their resolve had never been about conquest. It was about survival. It was about dignity. It was about home. Even as food grew scarce and weapons failed, their spirit remained ironclad. Because to them, surrender meant erasure, and erasure was worse than death. But beyond the forests and mountains of Yorubaland, another power was watching. Far away, in the bustling colonial outpost of Lagos, British merchants sipped tea and tallied losses. The war was bad for business. Trade routes were in shambles. Cocoa exports had collapsed. Palm oil shipments delayed. Their profits, like the land itself, were bleeding. And so, with pens instead of guns, the British stepped in. Diplomacy, cloaked in the language of peace, became their new weapon. They weren't offering help. They were preparing to rule. On September 23, 1886, in the quiet town of Imesi-Ile, a treaty was signed. It declared peace. It declared the Ekiti free. It promised that the war was over. But those who signed it knew the truth. The war hadn't truly ended. Not yet. The gunfire may have died down, but resentment still smoldered. Weapons were hidden in barns. Warriors still trained in secret. The memory of the war was still fresh. Too fresh. It would take another 7 years for the true silence to fall. In 1893, Governor Gilbert Thomas Carter of the British colony stepped into what was left of the camps. With firm commands and final orders, he demanded that all arms be laid down. The last swords were sheathed, the final gunshots silenced, not with a bang, but with a reluctant breath. And just like that, the Kiriji War, the greatest indigenous war the Yoruba had ever known, was over. But here's the thing about legends. They don't end when the battles do. The Ekiti-Parapo didn't just win their freedom, they carved their legacy into the soul of Yoruba history. Their name became a symbol, a story passed down from father to son, mother to daughter. They were proof that resilience, when held tightly enough, could bend even the strongest empire. They weren't the richest, they weren't the best armed, they didn't have the biggest cities, but they had something more important, a reason to stand, a reason to endure. Today, if you walk the paths of Okamesi or trace the routes between Igbaho and Imesi-Ile, you might still hear the echoes. You might still feel the pulse of the war that refused to be forgotten. The war that ended not with conquest, but with exhaustion. Not with a victor, but with the haunting truth that when brothers fight to the death, it is the stranger who inherits their father's land. This was no ordinary war. This was Kiriji. And from the ashes of that fire, a new age would rise, one not forged by kings or warriors, but by colonizers and their contracts. But that is a tale for another time. And in the end, that made all the difference. The Ekiti spirit was never built for chains. It was born for open skies, sacred hills, and the stubborn rhythm of a people who would rather die standing than live kneeling. When faced with conquest, they did not retreat into silence. They rose with fury and fire, with songs of freedom woven into every heartbeat. Fabunmi of Okemisi, Ogedengbe of Elesa, the kings, the warriors, the women who wailed to curse the enemy, the diviners who read fate in colonuts in the stars. Together they stood, not for power, not for glory, but for the right to say asterisk, this land is ours, and so is our destiny. The Kiriji War was never just a war. It was a statement, a roar across generations that no empire, no matter how iron-fisted, how vast, how ruthless, can silence a people who know who they are. That unity, when forged in fire, can withstand even the longest night. But here's the question that still lingers in the winds of Yorubaland. Was it truly a victory, or was it merely survival? What did we gain, and what did we lose? When the drums of war finally went silent, and the Union Jack was raised above Yoruba soil, the warriors laid down their arms. But did their struggle ever really end? Or did the battlefield simply change shape? Let us know what you think in the comments. Share your thoughts, because your voice is part of the story too. And if this story moved you, if you felt the echoes of those ancient battles, if you saw your ancestors standing in the shadows of the hills, then stay with us. More stories like this are coming. We release new episodes every week here on Folktale Cinema, where we bring you the forgotten, the buried, the legendary. Stories whispered by firelight, now told with the power they deserve. So hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications. Not because it's what everyone says, but because you never know which story might be your story. Until next time, remember, when memory fades, power rewrites the truth. But as long as we tell these tales, our ancestors never truly die. This is Folktale Cinema, keeping the fire burning, always.